Devamitra, in case you've not cast eyes on me before. And I'm very, very pleased to have this opportunity to launch this seminar on Milarepa. And what we're going to be doing over the coming weeks is looking at episodes which you'll find recounted in this book. It's a book that I can recommend very, very highly. It's been a great source of inspiration to me since I first read it, not quite since when it was first published. But if you're familiar with the fact that we have a number of books which we call spoken word project books, this is one of them. And I would say, well, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best. It's the one that I personally have taken the greatest amount of inspiration from. And it actually happened when I was on a solitary retreat. I was doing a month-long solitary retreat at Milarepa, where I've been many, many times. And on this occasion, I'd been on a retreat for 3 weeks. And I'd been very, very happy until this point. But then, at the beginning of the 4th week, I got restless. It's the sort of thing that happens in solitude. I got really restless and I wanted to go. The sort of thing that makes you want to go from a solitary retreat usually is lack of companionship. Sometimes you really yearn for companionship. And I was finding that was beginning to happen with me after 3 weeks. And I only had another week to go. I mean, it wasn't as if I was going to be there for much longer, but suddenly I just didn't want to be there. And so, of course, I had to deal with that. I had to face that and do something about it. And I sat and pondered it for half an hour or so. And then I remembered that I had this book with me, The Yogi's Joy. And I hadn't looked at it so far. I mean, I generally don't read very much on my solitary retreats, partly because reading can become such a distraction. But I picked it up. And I just read the first, I think it was 3 or 4 pages. And then I put it down. And I didn't read it again until after I'd left the retreat. Not because I didn't like it, but because in the first 3 or 4 pages, I was reminded why solitude is so important and why solitary retreats are so important. And, of course, the book is about Milarepa. And it's the first story that is recounted in that book. And it's all about solitude and the benefits of solitude. And in this particular story, Milarepa is missing his Vajra brothers. He wants to leave his retreat and go back and experience a little bit of companionship. So this is clearly very, very early on in Milarepa's wonderful career as a yogi, the great yogi of Tibet. He wasn't just a great yogi, by the way, he's a great singer. Apparently he had a very, very beautiful voice, and he's a poet. So he sang his poems, he sang his songs. And all his songs are dharmic. So he's the greatest poet of Tibet, as well as arguably being its greatest yogi, its greatest meditator. So Milarepa is a very, very colourful character. And he's been a great source of inspiration to me right from the very beginning of my involvement in Triratna, which now stems back almost 46 years. Very early on, I read the biography of Milarepa, and also the 100,000 songs of Milarepa, which, of course, there aren't literally 100,000 songs. It's just to give you the idea that there are rather a lot of them. Not quite 100,000, but there are quite a few. And they're very, very rich. And each so-called song, or each incident which is recounted, or incidents which are recounted, usually have several songs within them. And then not all the words in the songs are attributed to Milarepa. Some of the songs are attributed to people who come to see him or his disciples and so on, but clearly they're Milarepa's songs, and they're all worth reading. So that Milarepa's life, Milarepa's work as a poet, as a singer, have been a great source of inspiration to me. And I remember in particular when I went on my first solitary retreat, which was for 5 weeks. I was 26 or 27, I can't remember. I hadn't a clue what to expect. I got a bit of a shock. I wasn't used to prolonged solitude. Well, I suppose most of us are not. But 5 weeks was a particularly big bite of the cherry. And I got bored. I got seriously bored. And it was a huge disappointment to me, mainly because, of course, being 26 or 27 as I was, and being an arrogant young man as I also was, I sort of half imagined that I would be the second Milarepa. But it didn't work out like that. So I feel a very strong personal connection with Milarepa, and I'm very, very pleased, therefore, to be able to speak about him this evening and introduce you to him. And as Devamitra mentioned at the beginning of the class, well, he hoped that I would say something about Milarepa's background, Milarepa's life, and that's where I want to start now. I want to try to give you some sense of his life, which was quite unusual, quite remarkable too, in a number of different ways. I hope I can remember everything I want to recount. If I get in the details wrong, just jump in and let me know if I miss any key moments. So, it goes like this. Milarepa was born into a fairly wealthy family, and he had one sister. And when he was still fairly young, unfortunately, his father died. And his father had entrusted the property, they had land, a large house, and a certain amount of wealth, quite a bit of wealth by the standards of medieval Tibet, presumably. He entrusted it all into his brother to look after, to act as a kind of steward for Milarepa, who would then inherit this fortune when he came of age. But it didn't work out, as so often happens. Milarepa's uncle and aunt decided that they weren't going to do that. And in fact, they treated Milarepa, his sister, and his mother very, very badly. Basically reduced them to servitude, so that they had to work for the uncle and the aunt. And this went on for quite some time. Eventually, of course, Milarepa's mother she was fed up right from the beginning, but she got particularly fed up because when Milarepa reached maturity, of course she urged him to claim his inheritance from his uncle. But of course his uncle and aunt weren't going to give way. They didn't hand over the property to Milarepa. They kept it. In fact, they had a large gathering of their friends and local people, some of whom understood the situation and were very sympathetic to Milarepa and his mother and sister, but who did not dare speak out. And so, in a way, by deliberately holding this gathering at the time of Milarepa's arrival at maturity and celebrating their property, if you like, it was a claim. It was a claim which nobody questioned, and that's precisely what they had in mind. So, unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, Milarepa's mother had quite a strong vindictive streak, and she was quite a vengeful woman, and she spoke with Milarepa and insisted that he seek revenge. She wanted revenge for the wrongs that their uncle and aunt had committed against them. And so she sent him off in search of a black magic teacher, a master of the dark arts. She asked him quite specifically to learn how to destroy his uncle and aunt and their fortune. So Milarepa went off in search of a teacher. He agreed to do what his mother had asked. And eventually he was pointed in the direction of the best master of the dark arts that the local the local region had to offer. And he became his pupil. And very, very quickly, this man who was teaching Milarepa realized that he was an exceptionally gifted pupil. And so it took, after training for quite some time, Milarepa became very, very adept at the dark arts. And later on, in fact, was known as the Great Sorcerer. Marpa, his teacher, his teacher of the light path, the path to light, the path to enlightenment, used to refer to him as the Great Sorcerer. Anyway, Milarepa succeeded. He mastered the dark arts, and his teacher said, "Okay, the time has come. You have the arts necessary now to destroy your aunt and uncle and all their friends, all their property." Milarepa had become a master of. He learnt how to create thunderstorms and hailstorms, and so this is precisely what he did. He went away somewhere close to the house that should have been his, and generated a tremendous thunderstorm which destroyed the house. But it destroyed the house at a particularly important moment, because there was a family gathering taking place. I think that might have been a wedding. I can't quite remember that particular detail. But anyway, a lot of the family were there, and a lot of the local people who'd supported Milarepa's aunt and uncle in their greedy behaviour. And the thunderstorm completely destroyed the house, so the whole thing collapsed on everybody inside, and they were all killed. The text says 35 people died as a consequence of this sorcery. So Milarepa had fulfilled his pledge to his mother that he would learn the dark arts and destroy his aunt and uncle and their family. Except part of what he did, I can't remember whether this came from his mother or from his teacher. He spared his uncle and aunt for vindictive purposes. He wanted his mother, his uncle and aunt to suffer the grief of their loss. And so they were spared, and they were reduced to penury, just as Milarepa, his sister, and his mother had been. Anyway, having fulfilled his duty in that way, his dark duty, clearly it was not a good idea to hang around, because people would not have taken too kindly to the loss of their friends and relatives. So he disappeared off the scene for a while. But things were getting a little bit dangerous for his mother and his sister, because it was understood that basically his mother had put him up to this. So they called on him again and begged him to in order to stave off the danger that they, or the threat that they felt under, to do one more thing, which was to generate a hailstorm, a big hailstorm, to destroy the crops of all the people involved, of all the people in their local area. And so he also did this, and completely, with I think 2 or 3 great storms, completely destroyed the entire crop. And it had been a particularly rich harvest. He destroyed it the day before they were due to harvest. It's, of course, again, all the local people understanding that this young miller, he had these powers. They knew it was him. They knew he was the culprit, and that's what he had intended they should know, because that meant that they might be a bit more careful about behaving in a threatening way or plotting against his mother and sister. But as a consequence of all that, Milarepa eventually, talking things over with his teacher, who realized that he himself, the teacher himself, had probably done too many dark deeds, and especially in teaching this young genius at the black arts, he decided he needed to follow the path to enlightenment. It was time to give up these dark deeds, give up the dark arts, and this seemed to prompt Milarepa's conscience. And he realized, well, if his teacher felt this way, then he needed to as well. And suddenly he was overcome by great remorse. And he realized that he needed to find the very best teacher, because of all the destruction that and all the havoc that he'd wreaked, and the death that he'd brought about. And so he set out this time in search of a guru on the white path, a guru on the path of enlightenment. And eventually he heard of Marpa the translator, the very famous another very famous Tibetan figure. He was a married Lama who made several trips to India to bring back Indian Buddhist texts and translate them into Tibetan. But he's also a very, very great guru, very great teacher. So Milarepa sought out Marpa and eventually found him. And Milarepa took him on as, Marpa took him on as a disciple. But Milarepa, of course, didn't have any wealth. He had nothing to offer Marpa. And Marpa made his life very, very difficult. Not because he had no wealth to offer, as it happens. Marpa was well aware of the death and destruction that Milarepa had brought about. But being aware of that, he understood perfectly well that if Milarepa was to make sufficient advancement with the Dharma, then he needed to purify himself first. And so began Milarepa's very, very trying apprenticeship under Marpa. Marpa agreed to support him, give him the food that he needed, and to give him the teachings and initiations. But first, he must build a house. So Marpa single-handedly began building a house. Halfway after its construction, the Marpa said, "No, I've changed my mind. I don't want the house there. It's in the wrong place. Pull it down. We'll start again." So Milarepa had to do that. And then the same thing happened again. He got Milarepa to build another house. And again, Marpa said, no, it's in the wrong place. We'll have to put it somewhere else. Next time, the house was going to be, I think, of 5 stories. So Milarepa set to build out a house of 5 stories. And as it was approaching completion, Marpa again said, "No, not there. This is the wrong place. It needs to be somewhere else." And this time he wanted a house of 10 stories. And so Marpa set to with this house, building this house of 10 stories. With regards to the houses he'd already built, by the way, part of the deal was that he had to replace the stones from where he got them, just to make his job very, very thorough. So, as a consequence of all this, Marpa gradually became more and more demoralized because he was not... Thank you. Old man's brain. I'm 70 today, that's the problem. So yes, Milarepa, lost my track now. Well, it was Milarepa had to put back all the stones from where he got them before he could start the new houses. So Milarepa was becoming more and more demoralized by this, because every time he was beginning to complete a house, Marpa would find a problem about it in some way or other, and he wouldn't give him the teachings. And this, as you can imagine, this went on for quite a long time. I don't know how long it would take to build 4 houses, especially one of almost 10 stories, single-handedly. But Marpa, that's what Marpa insisted that Milarepa had to do. Meanwhile, fortunately for Milarepa, Marpa had a very indulgent wife called Devamitra. And Devamitra took a shine to Milarepa. And she took care of him and encouraged him. And said, "I'm sure that Marpa will eventually give you teachings. You know he's got a terrible temper. You know how foul his temper is. And of course sometimes he gets drunk. And that makes things worse. But you just have to make allowances for him. He is nonetheless a very, very great teacher. Sooner or later, he will give you the teachings. You just got to endure it. You just got to stick it out." And Marpa, I beg your pardon, Milarepa did stick it out for quite a long time, but eventually he just could not take it anymore. He'd had enough. And he decided he was going to leave. So he did leave. But he didn't leave for very long, because when he left, he realized that difficult though life was with Marpa, it was going to be even more difficult without Marpa. But more importantly than that, he realized that because of his past evil deeds, unless he gained enlightenment in this life, he was going to be going to a very dark place. In other words, he would be reborn into a state of intense suffering. And this realization was one of it's what drove Milarepa. This is Jnanavaccha mentioned earlier Milarepa's great urgency, his urgency to practice the Dharma. Well, it came from this realization that he committed so much evil in this life. Unless he gained enlightenment, he could not avoid being reborn in a state of suffering, of intense suffering. And so this was one of the factors which drove him forward, which kept his mind focused. So he went back to Marpa after he'd left. But then again, Marpa was getting very angry with him, was beating him, and also behaving very, very badly towards him. Milarepa couldn't understand this. He knew that Marpa was a great teacher. He sort of understood why Marpa was behaving so badly towards him. And that's what really kept his faith in Marpa alive. He did somewhere believe that sooner or later Marpa would give way and give him the teachings that he was asking for. But even then, it didn't come straight away. And Marpa behaved particularly badly towards him one further time, and Milarepa began to feel suicidal. And he thought, I can't continue with this. And even Devamitra, Marpa's wife, couldn't assuage the pain that he felt. And so he decided that he must leave. He must find another teacher. He couldn't stand Marpa any longer. So Devamitra, Marpa's wife, recommended to him another teacher that he could go to. So he went to this other teacher. And eventually, he was doing quite well with his other teacher, but he'd gone there on false pretenses. Devamitra had written a false letter, as if it was from Marpa, recommending Milarepa to this other teacher. And also gave things to Milarepa which she had no business to give to him, which were things which are the personal property of Marpa, to give as an offering to the new teacher. And the new teacher was greatly flattered by this. And what happened next was that, well, eventually the new teacher felt that he needed to go and visit Marpa and take this great young disciple he'd taken on with him, which of course was completely ruinous to Devamitra's plans and to Milarepa's hopes. Marpa did not welcome Milarepa back with open arms. He was furious. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew how his wife had behaved. He understood her treachery. He knew all along, apparently. And he understood he knew where Milarepa was, and he knew what was going on, basically. As it happened, there was a big initiation ceremony for some of Marpa's disciples. And Milarepa was not going to be invited. Again, he was snubbed. In the end, Milarepa, poor man, he was so dispirited by all this. Once more, Devamitra intervened on his behalf. Said, look, he really, really is desperate. If you do this one more time, I can't answer for the consequences. So Marpa gave way. And eventually, he gave Milarepa the teachings. And then Milarepa came to understand what perhaps he'd intuited all along, that this whole process of building houses, pulling them down, being treated very, very badly by his teacher Marpa, had a purpose, and the purpose was to purify him of his past karma, his past bad actions, his past evil actions, so that he could stand a chance of putting the teachings, putting the initiations into effect, into practice. So what happened then was that Marpa went off, Milarepa, having been initiated, was told by Marpa to go to a particular cave and meditate there. And he would provide him with food. So Milarepa went off to this cave, for 11 months. It was his first solitary retreat, again, an 11-month solitary retreat. He walled himself up and didn't come out. But after 11 months, Milarepa and Devamitra went to visit him and say they wanted him to come back. They wanted him to come back. Milarepa wanted to see how far he got with the initiations and so forth. So Milarepa, at this stage, rather reluctantly, pulled down the wall. In fact, at first he wouldn't do that. They had to start pulling the wall down for him. And Devamitra said, "Look, you're going to have to pull this wall down. Otherwise, you know what he gets like. You don't want to inspire him with wrath yet again." So Milarepa pulled the wall down, and they went back. And Milarepa gave him further teachings, and then packed him off again. This time for 3 years, into another cave, and he had to wall himself up, and he must not leave until the 3 years were up. This is really, really important. In the meantime, Milarepa had, I think by this stage, mastered the practice of what we call tumo. Tumo is the generation of inner psychic heat. Because as you can imagine, living in a cave in Tibet, well, they weren't centrally heated, and so it was a bit chilly in there. And so the only way to keep warm was to generate this tumo, this inner fire. So he'd mastered this practice. So now he's all set to really put the teachings into practice. But what then happened was that after he'd been there for merely 1 year, he had a dream. And he dreamt of his mother. And he dreamt of his sister. And he dreamt that his mother had died. And in this dream, he saw the old house destroyed. And he saw what he thought was the remains of his mother. And this deeply, deeply distressed him. And so he thought, well, I've got to go there. He felt he wanted to see his mother again. He wanted to know the truth. And so he broke down the wall, went back to see Milarepa, who was not impressed, not at all happy with what Milarepa had done, but nonetheless they talked it over, and eventually Milarepa agreed, okay, go to this distant place, your native place, go and see your mother. So he did. And when he got there, he saw the destruction that his magic had wreaked. And he didn't dare go there during the daytime, actually. He just waited nearby until darkness had fallen. And then he went over the ruined house in search of his mother, or any sign of his mother. And what he found was a bag of bones. And he knew intuitively, instinctively, they were the bones of his mother. And of course this caused him very, very great distress. But anyway, he'd returned to this place. He wanted to be back in this area. So he went off then to meditate in a nearby cave. And he begged alms from the local people. And the local people knew who he was. They recognized him. And again, they weren't particularly well disposed towards him. They remembered the past. And so they were reluctant to give him alms. But gradually they did give him alms. And he was able to meditate in this place. And in his home place, in a cave nearby to his home. Now, I don't know how that story strikes you so far. I mean, do you think it would make a good film? Make a good movie? There's something lacking, really, isn't there? Don't you think? What's lacking? What does any decent Hollywood movie have?
A snog.
A dog?
A snog.
Did you say a dog?
Romance.
No.
Romance.
Romance. Ah! Yes. Sorry, I thought you said dog. It's his fault, talking about the other dogs. Yes, there's no romance in it, is there?
Or dogs.
Well, actually, there is a love interest in this story, but I left it out because being Buddhist, I didn't think you'd be interested. So shall I put it back in?
Yay!
Okay. So when Milarepa was young, he was betrothed to a young lady called Zese. Presumably that both families had arranged this. They were betrothed. One day they would get married. And well, what happened was that Zese, after Milarepa had wreaked he conquered these storms, destroyed so much property, the crops, killed so many people. Zese was not attractive as an option for anybody else because she would be associated presumably with ill fortune. And in any case, they would be worried because what would Milarepa do if they found that his betrothed had been married off to somebody else? So Zese remained unmarried, but she never forgot Milarepa. And so when he returned, she went to the cave. She'd heard he was there, she went to the cave and she gave him food and told him that she'd remained faithful to him all this time. So that's romantic element. I don't want to go into too much detail. I've probably gone into more detail than I should have done. But let me just say one more thing in relation to that, which is that they had a bit of a long conversation about land and all sorts of other things. And Milarepa asked about his sister, and she didn't know Zese didn't know where his sister had gone to. She just disappeared one day, went off begging, wanted to get away completely from the home. Eventually, Zese managed to find Milarepa's sister, and they brought his sister. She brought his sister to see Milarepa, and his sister was very, very pleased to see him again, of course, and Milarepa was happy to be reunited with his sister. But there was something not quite right. I mean, his sister Peter had seen another Lama not that long ago, and this Lama had very nice robes and clothes and sat on a high throne. And so she said to Milarepa, well, don't you think you ought to clean yourself up and, go about this religious job a bit better? I mean, look at you, you look like a complete and utter beggar. And by this time, Milarepa was very, very emaciated. Perhaps even by this stage, he'd been living on nettle soup for too long. So perhaps his skin had turned green, because he did eventually turn green from just relying too much and for too long on nettle soup. It turns the skin green if you just live on nettle soup all the time, apparently. So Milarepa looked rather green. But worse than that, the only clothes he had was a simple kind of, well, it wasn't even a robe, really. It was more like a smock, because, shame to say, it didn't cover his genitals. So his genitals were completely exposed. So his sister suggested, well, maybe, you should have some proper clothes. Partly with this in mind, Milarepa would not have anything to do with that at all. There are a number of incidents, actually, where Milarepa, at least two or three incidents I can think of, where Milarepa's disciples get a bit concerned about his nakedness and speak to him about his shame and suggest that maybe he should cover himself up. And in each instance, they're berated because he said you can't distinguish between proper shame and things which are really genuinely shameful and things which are not. He said you feel no shame at the lies and the deceit that you engage in, or the greed that you indulge, and yet you feel shame at the sight of me in my natural form, the way nature made me. So you see, Milarepa was not a conventional man. He'd probably be put in prison these days, but that was the man. He was a great tantric guru. So what happened next was that Milarepa eventually gained enlightenment, and he had many, many, many disciples. And he spent all his life teaching, meditating in caves, staying really quite high up in the mountains. There are a number of caves in the vicinity of Mount Everest which are associated with Milarepa. And so you can imagine what that's like. I mean, it's really high, it's really cold. I know, I've been there. When I was 23, way back in 1971, I did a trek to Mount Everest. And that's at a time when there were no tourist lodges on the trails. I spent one night sharing a kind of a stall with a yak. It was the only accommodation we could get one night. Anyway, so that must have been pretty much how it was in Milarepa's time. But I tell no lie. I didn't get a moment's sleep because yaks chew the cud all night long, and it's very noisy, believe me. Anyway, did eventually make it up the Khumbu Valley, walked across the Khumbu Glacier up to the base camp where there's an expedition climbing the mountain. Anyway, won't bore you with all that. The following day, walked up, scrambled up Kalapatar, which is a hill directly opposite Mount Everest, which is 20,000 feet high. I guess about that, roughly 7,000 meters. It's about 2/3 the height of Mount Everest. And standing on this, the top of this hill, I was absolutely, thrilled at the sight of the entire Everest region, which, it's like a large circle of mountains, the most beautiful, the highest peaks in the world. Really, really quite awe-inspiring, but totally inhospitable. And I looked over into Tibet, looking north, and you just got these enormous peaks. And in that region, Milarepa had caves where he frequently meditated. And believe me, it was very cold up there. Even during the day, it was very, very cold indeed. And it's a very dangerous place because every hour or so, you'd hear what sounded like thunder. But it wasn't thunder. It was the sound of yet another avalanche. So it's a very, very wild, even quite dangerous place to be. But Milarepa made his home there. He made his home in these caves. And, I suppose making home is perhaps not quite the right way to describe Milarepa's life. He stayed there, he meditated there, and survived. He subsisted there, mostly on nettle soup, till he turned green. One of the most striking things about Milarepa, reading his life and his encounters with various people and with the environment, is his great love of nature, the beauty of nature, and of the animals. In one of his songs, he's singing about the monkeys chattering in the trees, swinging around from branch to branch. And he's just laughing at them. He's laughing at the crows. He's laughing at these creatures. He feels completely in harmony with them. It's almost like his laughter is a form of love for them. So there's this aspect to Milarepa's life. He had a great love of natural beauty. And really, the most awe-inspiring natural beauty you're likely to encounter on this planet. But very inhospitable. So this is one of the elements of Milarepa's life which I greatly appreciate. Clearly he was quite a heroic man. To do what he did. He spent most of his life in solitude. He was in the mountains with no comfort other than the warmth that he could generate to keep himself warm beneath this thin cotton robe which only came thus far. Well, just imagine you stumble across Milarepa in a cave somewhere. Let's say you got up there. You just can't stumble across him, this little green man, sitting in meditation, eyes closed, deeply absorbed, totally emaciated. He must have looked ancient as well by this stage. And sometimes people did wander up to where he was, not perhaps always knowing who he was or there was anyone there at all. And sometimes they recoiled in horror. They thought it was a ghost. Of course, we might think he was from Mars, having turned green. Little green man, sorry. Yes, so Milarepa was very determined and very heroic, very ascetic, and so were all his principal disciples. He had many disciples, many followers, many patrons, he would call them. They'd come to visit him. They'd come to bring him food, make him offerings. They'd try to get him to go down into the valley and become resident in their villages and so forth. Of course, he always resisted that. But sometimes he would come down. Sometimes he would go to a feast or a banquet. Sometimes he would wander down for alms. And again, very often people would wonder who this disgusting creature was. This tiny little old man with a green complexion, totally emaciated. But of course, gradually his reputation spread, and people knew that there was a very, very great a very great yogi in the mountains. And so he did a lot of teaching. People would come to him, they'd beg him for some kind of Dharma teaching, and he'd sing them a song. And he'd sing them a song about their cares, about the pain and suffering that they endure in the samsara, and try to tease them away and out of that. And so gradually he built around him a number of very, very devoted disciples, both men and women, all of whom, his most devoted disciples, lived themselves in caves and led that very, very ascetic life. This happened a number of times with particularly young people. There's a young shepherd who goes to see him on one occasion and immediately becomes impressed by Milarepa. I can't remember whether he was 14 or 16, he was very, very young. And Milarepa sends him off in pursuit of his mind. So there's a sort of chapter in the 100,000 Songs called The Shepherd's Search for Mind. But he's a teenage shepherd. But he's a very, very gifted teenage shepherd, and eventually became one of Milarepa's great disciples. And there's another one of his great disciples was a young woman called Sale Aoi. I probably mispronounced that, but that's the best I can do. And I didn't want to leave you without some of the words that you find in Milarepa's song. So these words are in the mouth of Sale Aoi, but it gives you the kind of flavour. And believe me, what I'm going to read to you is relatively mild, so that's a warning. Just a short verse from a very long song in response to something that Milarepa has said to her. She's about to make a request, and so it brings us back to love interest, really. At first, a lover is an angel. Next, a demon, frightening and outrageous. In the end, a fierce elephant who threatens to destroy you. Thinking thus, I feel sad and weary. Now, this maid shall devote herself to the Dharma. Now, she will join her Vajra brothers. So that's Sale Aoi. She was 16, and she became one of the four foremost female disciples of Milarepa. I mentioned that Milarepa had a certain sense of humour. At least I think I did. I certainly mentioned that he would sometimes laugh at the animals. But his sense of humour would come out in other contexts as well, as a famous occasion where Milarepa was meditating at night in some remote cave, and someone had crept up to his cave surreptitiously in the night, in the hope that, in the belief actually, that Milarepa had some wealth stored in the cave. Milarepa was aware of what was going on, even though this particular thief was very, very quiet. And he simply said, "Good luck. I can't even find anything by day. You're welcome to take anything you can find by night." So clearly Milarepa was a man with a sense of humour. And this comes out in a number of different ways, although this may not necessarily be humour, but as I mentioned, Milarepa had a number of great disciples. But the greatest of all was Gampopa. Gampopa was, in his own right, a very, very great teacher, became a very great teacher, and wrote a very, very famous text called The Jewel Ornament of Liberation. And he became enlightened. But before he became enlightened, he was a monk, but he'd heard of Milarepa, and he wanted to go to Milarepa to receive teachings, to become a disciple. It's interesting that Gampopa was a monk, Milarepa was not. Milarepa never became a monk. He never took the robe, so to speak. He didn't need to. but he never formally became a monk, even though he led a life which was far more austere than the vast majority of monks would feel comfortable with. Anyway, Gampopa was his greatest pupil, and Milarepa knew when he met him, when he set eyes on him, that here was his most gifted disciple. And Gampopa spent quite a lot of time with Milarepa, but eventually Milarepa sent him away. He sent him away to communicate the Dharma, to preach the Dharma. But he said, as Gampopa was leaving, he said, "Look, there's still one more pith teaching, but I'm sorry, I just can't give it to you yet. It's so precious a teaching, I can't give it to you just yet." So Gampopa, obviously a little bit saddened by this, because he thinks he may never see Milarepa again. So Gampopa leaves Milarepa, and as he's well into the distance, almost beyond earshot, Milarepa calls him back. He said, "I've changed my mind." Even though this is the most profound teaching I can give you, I now believe actually that you may benefit from it, so I'm going to give it to you. And so Gampopa said, "Well, do I need to make a special offering? Do I need to prepare for it?" He said, No, you don't need to do that. So he turned away from Gampopa and simply lifted up his robe. And his whole body was covered in calluses. And especially, of course, the area around his posterior, where he'd spent years in meditation. And then he turned and looked back at Gampopa and said, "Remember, the most important teaching is practice. Practice the Dharma." And this had a huge impact upon Gampopa. So that was his most profound teaching, and one which we can all learn from. No matter how much you know or learn about the Dharma, it's useless unless you put it into effect. I'd like to finish on a more personal note. I've mentioned earlier, I think, that Milarepa has been a great source of inspiration to me throughout my life. That was especially true in the early years, and again, even more true in recent years. I've spent quite a bit of time in solitude. I've done a number of solitary retreats. It's one aspect of Sangharakshita's teaching I've always taken very seriously. He had hoped that every order member would go away and do at least 1 month's solitary retreat every year. And most years I've managed that. Not every year, but most years I have. There was a period when I couldn't afford to go on solitary retreat for about 7 or 8 years, when I was in my early 50s, but that's no longer the case. I can go on solitary retreat once more. In fact, I'll be leaving solitary retreat again another 4 weeks, just for a month. But I've done many, many month-long solitary retreats. I've done 1 3-month-long solitary retreat. I've done 1 9-month solitary retreat. But it's in the last 7 or 8 years, really, that I felt the full force and impact of Milarepa's teaching. When I was on my 9-month solitary retreat, he became particularly important to me because it was the longest retreat I've ever done. It's the longest solitary retreat I've ever done, and I'm not likely to have that opportunity again in this life. Probably won't even, well, I don't know, I was going to say I might not live long enough, but my life's very uncertain. All our lives are uncertain, but when you've got cancer, it's even more uncertain. But I was deeply inspired on my 9-month solitary retreat by Milarepa's example. And I read one of his songs every night, just before going to bed, maybe for about 20 minutes, no longer than that. And I always took deep inspiration from his words. And gradually, as I went through that retreat, I felt more and more that I could understand what he was singing about. I understood his words in a way that I'd not understood before, because he was singing, he was writing so much from solitude. And there's a very strange thing about solitude. The longer you are alone, there's a certain kind of momentum builds. It builds so gradually you don't notice it. But nonetheless, that momentum the intensity of that momentum builds hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month, imperceptibly. And so the further I went into my retreat, the more Milarepa's songs seemed to carry great meaning and significance to me, and became a deeper source of inspiration to me. But it's of course not just me. Many people, many Buddhists throughout the ages have taken great inspiration from Milarepa, because in a way he really is the archetypal hermit. He's the archetypal Buddhist hermit. And there have been many recluses, hermits, whatever we call them, throughout Buddhist history. But none really stand out quite so much, so prominently in this regard as Milarepa. And he served as a source of inspiration for all of them. He served as a great inspiration to me. He served as a great inspiration for many order members. I hope he serves as a great inspiration to you also. And I hope that in the coming weeks you'll come to these classes and hear more and more about Milarepa's life, Milarepa's teaching, and benefit from it. So I'm going to stop there, but we don't have to completely stop there. Maybe if you just want to pause for however long it takes, see if there's any questions you'd like to ask. Yes?
Where did you go for the 9-month retreat?
Guhyalaka, the men's ordination retreat centre. You're well serviced there. They bring you food once a week in a bin, about 200 metres away. Well, you know, I mean, Dhammema and Mahaprabhu used to bring food to Milarepa. Even Milarepa couldn't live just on air.
Which period of time Milarepa was living according to the Buddhist mythology?
Sorry, which?
Period of time?
Oh, Milarepa. He was alive. He was alive at the Battle of Hastings, so he wasn't there, of course. 1066. You wouldn't know that, of course. 1066. He flourished in the 11th century of the Common Era. I think he's thought to have been born around about 1040 or something like that, and he lived to be 85. And he is the founder of the Kagyupa school of Tibetan Buddhism. If you know anything about Tibetan Buddhism, there are 4 principal schools, and the Kagyupa school looked to Milarepa as their founder. And in acknowledgement of that, they all wear a yellow robe beneath their nicely laundered maroon robes. They're not cotton thin robes. And they live in monasteries, not in caves. But it's strange, isn't it? You have a school, a whole school of Buddhism, in which there are many monks, and yet Milarepa himself was never a monk. Strictly speaking, of course he was a monk, in a sense, but he was never formally a monk. Well, maybe we should call it a night.